Hello, I am Joseph Bonello from the Department of Computer Information Systems at the University of Malta. I will be discussing a system for automating fair assessment to improve tool and data discovery and reusability. I will first discuss the motivation, the need for having FAIR. I will discuss the first principles, what a FAIR score is not, so how it should not be interpreted, automating the assessments, so our process for automating the assessments, interpreting the FAIR scores, and our ideas for future work. As a researcher, one of the problems that I find when I'm starting a project is how to find the tools, the best tools that I can use and the data that I can use for my studies. And so we thought of this project as a way to create a semi-automatic assessment tool for datasets and bioinformatics tools. So, as you know, the research community generates many datasets and tools which in turn are reused in other research, or hopefully they are reused in other research. The question then becomes how best to use these tools and which tools work well with particular data and with particular platforms. Ideally, the tools that we use are interoperable, so they should run on as many platforms as possible. They shouldn't be tied with any particular platform. And moreover, it is a problem sometimes getting access to the data that is used in particular studies, so you cannot use it as a benchmark. Then there is also the issue of having transparency and reproducibility in published scientific literature. We have seen in the past that this is a little bit of a problem because sometimes it is not possible to reproduce a study because, for example, the data is not available. FAIR offers a set of principles that can be used by machines and researchers to find, access, interoperate, and reuse research objects, and specifically tries to address this problem of finding the right tools and reusing the tools in research. FAIR is an acronym for its four principles. The first principle is Findability, which states that the requirement that the data being generated is made findable, so you can go to a repository or through a search engine and find the data and the tools that you need. Accessibility, so this addresses the need that newly generated and previously existing data and other digital assets should be accessible through a trustworthy repository, and that trustworthy repository means that it is able to safeguard the licensing issues or the issues that are necessary for data to be shared among others. So you cannot, this is not about making data openly available to anyone. This is about making data accessible in such a way that licenses are respected, or if there needs to be some permission that needs to be granted, that permission is respected. It also defines interoperability, which is a principle that the data can be integrated with other data, so it is not in some proprietary format that requires the acquisition of expensive software in order to be used in a research project. And reusability, so the optimization of reusability of data as well of tools, and this would entail having clear usage licenses and accurate information on where the data is sourced, where it comes from. The FAIR principles were formulated by Wilkinson et al. In 2016 with the aim of enhancing data reusability. One of the key things that the authors have done in this study was to identify the stakeholders. So stakeholders do not just include academia, but also funding agencies and publishers, who are important stakeholders when data is required. The principles are mainly targeted towards machines. So here the idea is that machines should be able to discover and use information to support individuals. So the machines would do the hard work of identifying where the data is, and they should be able to also understand what the data is about in order to help individuals in answering certain queries, in obtaining the data. Now, FAIR is not a metric that shows the quality of a resource. So the FAIR scores should not be interpreted as how good a resource is, and one cannot and should not interpret a FAIR score as implying that the resource or the data is of a high quality. So it does not, it is, they do not go together. But it should be interpreted as how easy it is to find and reuse a resource. So we can then use that data, for example, in order to confirm a result, to refute the result, or to use as a benchmark or a baseline if it is correct. So we can have something to compare your research against that. FAIR is not a standard as one would expect out of a standard. So it is simply a set of principles that are an indication of how accessible a resource is. It is also not equivalent to open, so data can be made available only as long as certain conditions are met. So if you are using medical data, for example, which requires the consent of the participants who have provided that data, then the data should only be made available once the consent has been obtained by the participants for sharing the data. Our aim is to automate the process of generating FAIR scores for tools and data. So a machine is able there is a machine that is able to look at the data and generate the process for creating a score according to the FAIR principles. The principles we are using were outlined by Lamprecht et al. From 2019 with some slight modifications, and those slight modifications are essentially we are adding a weight towards certain features. For example, for a tool to be findable, it should have a website, or the website should be known, so should be found very quickly if you do a quick search engine search for the tool using its name. So we think that should have more weight than some other information. So the assessment can be done for datasets, tools, and for whole pipelines, and I will explain what this is in a few slides. So the system tries to find information about a resource through a series of internet searches, but it may fail due to issues such as parsing, or because there are some terminologies that are not in its current list in its current vocabulary, essentially. In order to overcome this problem, authors or users can edit the information gathered by the system if that information is missing. An overview of the process is, so the tool searches does an internet search, essentially for tools or for the tool or the data set. If a website is found, then it is able to it starts calculating the FAIR score. So it looks at the website, finds information that it needs, and it generates a score accordingly. If the website is not found, obviously it cannot find information about the dataset or the resource, and the metrics are all failed. The tool has some features that it measures for findability and the rest of the principles. So for findability, it checks for data, that the data is properly described using rich metadata. It looks for a globally unique identifier. It looks for an identifier where the metadata clearly and explicitly includes identifiers for the data it describes. It checks whether the data is registered or indexed in a publicly searchable resource. It checks that the data is refindable at any point in time, which means that the information that describes the data set is persistent. So even if at some point in the future the data is taken offline for some reason, the metadata that describes the information should remain available. And it also checks that there is some basic machine actionable metadata. So ideally, the metadata used is linked to some public ontology. For accessibility, the tool checks that the metadata are retrieved through some open API, which can be open, free, and universally implementable. It checks if the protocol allows for authentication and authorization procedures. Typically, if we look at some publicly accessible API over HTTP, then we think that we consider that to be a good feature for accessibility. We check that the metadata would remain accessible if it is within a standard repository that supports metadata, persistent metadata, then we consider that a pass. And we also check that both machines and humans should be able to judge the actual accessibility of the data object. So if a human and the machine are able to access or to find that metadata or to access the API, then we consider that a pass. For interoperability, we check that the data and metadata are formally accessible and shared using an applicable language. So, for example, it should use English, for example. We check that that data and metadata use vocabularies that follow the FAIR principles. We check that there are qualified references to other data and metadata. So if a data set refers to another data set, we check that the links actually work, and that the second data set also follows the FAIR principles. We check that data and metadata are machine actionable. We check for the use of shared ontologies and standard ontologies. And we also check that the data and metadata are syntactically parsable as well as semantically machine accessible. For reusability, we check that the data and metadata are richly described and are accurate and relevant. We check that the metadata is clear and has a clear and accessible data usage license. We also check that there is detailed provenance, so that it is possible to do proper citations, and that the data and metadata are sufficiently described and rich so that a machine is able to understand them with minimal human effort. So this is what one would expect from the tool. So this is an example from the dashboard, which shows you for each tool that it has, whether it gives you a score for each tool under each of the FAIR principles. There is also a link on the right which says add to pipeline, so that one can create their own pipelines according to the methodologies that they have used in the study. In order to understand these scores better, one would go into each tool, and the features that we are using, that we are testing and assessing under each principle would be described. In this example, you would see that, for example, the download link has a score of 40%, and that is the weight that I mentioned earlier. So we are saying here that the download link has more importance than the other features in the findability. However, the total of the features would contribute towards 100% in the findability score. This is an example of the pipeline feature. So a pipeline it can be described as a sequence of tools that are used in order to produce an output. So these would feature in the methodology of a study. In the top part of the slide, you will see the assessment scores for the FAIR principles for the whole pipeline. So in this case, this pipeline has a score of 93% in findability. In the bottom part, you will see that at the top there are the tools that are used in order to produce the output in this pipeline, and for each tool there is a findability assessment for each tool. In order to understand why, for example, Sequencer has 65%, then one would need to go on Sequencer, and then you would see a breakdown of the scores for that particular tool, as we have seen in the previous slide. For the future, we intend to address a few issues. For example, one thing that we want to do is we would like to introduce a quality assurance step. So this can be an automated process. So imagine what we want to do is to say, if somebody edits the criteria for a particular tool and says, okay, this particular tool has a DOI which your tool has not found, we want to be able to say to verify whether the data that has been provided is correct or not, and we want to include this as one of the steps in the process. We want to address some speed issues and accuracy issues. The speed issues are not very concerning because the assessment can be done in the background, and then once the assessment is done, a result will be sent to the user. As regards the accuracy issues, what we want to do is we want to increase the vocabulary and the feature and the things that the tool would look for in order to make an assessment. We also want to be able to add new rubrics and automate the process when new rubrics are published. This is a process that is going to be done as we continue evolving the tool. The system can be accessed at the address that I'm giving in the slide, should you wish to try it. I would like to thank my collaborators in this project, Mr. Nigel Alfino, who is the undergraduate student who has worked most on this tool, and Professor Ernest Kakia, who has provided a lot of very insightful information and to this project. I would also like to thank the Greek C community, where the idea for this project has originated. So thank you very much for your attention, and I would welcome any questions that you might have.